It's Codex Beats.
Bang, bang.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Foreign Policy. And today we're going to be talking about League of Nations. In actual fact, we should be talking of United Nations. But we've decided to start from League of Nations as the week 5 of the discussions or the learning under foreign policy. The name is H. Kwame Afaglo. I'll be your presenter. And the objectives would be viewers would be reminded of the history and origin of League of Nations briefly. Then we will take you through, or I will take you through World War I as the precursor of League of Nations, how League of Nations came about. Then we go to the organs of League of Nations. We look at the successes of League of Nations. Then we would also explain or critically look at what caused the dissolution of League of Nations from its weaknesses. Those are the areas that we'll be going to. And so let's zoom straight into action so we don't waste too much time of viewers. League of Nations, it's the first intergovernmental organizations in the world. The first intergovernmental organizations or international organizations that looks at governmental togetherness with the intention of what? Ensuring there is peace and security in the world. All right. There is cooperation and peace and security in the world. Thank you. League of Nations was formed in the summer of 1919 or 1920. League of Nations was started. The covenants of League of Nations came into being, or League of Nations came into being in 1919 or 1920. Some others say 1919, some others say 1920, because it came out of Paris Peace Conference that spanned between 1919 and 1920. There, the US President Woodrow Wilson put in certain requests, and those requests had to be adhered to, and that led to the formation of what? League of Nations. Why should there be an international intergovernmental organizations that covers the whole world? It was because prior to then there was the First World War. That's the Great War that took away so many lives, millions of lives, from 1914 to 1919. So that Great War, government decided, or leadership in most countries decided that no, that shouldn't happen again. And if that shouldn't happen, then it means that the only way is that all governments or governments that are involved in war must come together and agree to a certain paper agreement, an agreement that is put on paper that they will not go to war again. They will opt for peace. And before the rapture should ever happen, there must be arbitration so that the rapture doesn't even happen at all. So that is what League of Nations sets to do. It was the treaty was under Versailles, somewhere in Paris, just a bit outside of Paris. Versailles, I don't know how it's pronounced properly, but Versailles. Versailles, so they call it Versailles Treaty. Treaty is an agreement. All right. If you look at it carefully, World War I was the one that gave birth to the League of Nations. Under World War I, it was one battle, like I said, that took away many lives, and that is recorded. I don't want to quote the numbers because I'm not too sure about those numbers myself. All right, so I don't want to quote those numbers of those who died. All right, so there was two sides to the war. It takes two to tango is a dance, but we normally say it takes two to tango. It takes two to war. Okay, there's one side as the Allied powers and the Central powers. The Allied powers were made of France, Britain, Japan, Italy, USA. Then the Central powers was led by Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary, and a few others. Okay, it was one war that was caused by killing of a monarch or something like that. So, and that sparked up a lot of crisis, which was already simmering. Okay, so then that war took away so many lives, as I've already indicated. So it was at the summer of that war's end that government decided that no, let us sit and meet and discuss peace. We don't have to take our lives that way because it was needless devastation. So then that was the precursor of League of Nations under the Paris Peace Conference that was signed in Versailles. Okay. So we look at the organs of League of Nations that was formed in 1920 or 1919, 1920. All right. So the League of Nations was signed by some group of nations. At the time, most African countries had no independence, so they were not part of the League of Nations. Most African countries had no government at the time. At 1920, they didn't have governments as well-established countries, and they were okay. So then, League of Nations had 5 organs or 5 arms. That's the Council. The Council is the principal point of resolving differences, and they were in the business of high power decision making. The permanent members of the Council of League of Nations were actually the proponents. They were the allied powers: France, Japan, Italy, Britain. US was not part. Take note, US was not part. But US facilitated the Paris Peace Conference. Okay. US was not part. Okay. So they made the permanent members of the council. That is France, Britain, Italy, and Japan. Then they adapted some other members from the assembly. So the other organ is the assembly, where all nations belong. All states belong. All independent states belong, actually. So then, that's how it came about. They had International Labour Organization, ILO. Then they had the Secretariat. The Secretariat is the administrative arm for both the council and the assembly. Then there's Permanent Court for International Justice that resolves differences and looks at the legal interpretations of events. All right. So the League of Nations had these arms, and with those arms, it presupposed that all members must sign up to a certain treaty. And the aim of the League of Nations was to ensure there was peace and security, there was cooperation. Organized individuals must be respected. They did not state human rights, but they must be respected. And then, importantly, those private munition manufacturers were to be advised against that, because it put other states that were not munition manufacturers in danger. So you see where realism comes in. Okay. Then it went on to look at if there's conflict. If there is conflict and it increases or its tempo goes high, before rupture, there must be an intervention, that is arbitration, by the Council of the League of Nations. And have they done that severally? Yes, we'll look at that. So having looked at the organs of League of Nations, let's look at the successes of League of Nations. Because it came out of the First World War, League of Nations had some residual cases of the war to handle. One of them was prisoners of war of World War I, the Great War. So they negotiated and had 500,000 prisoners of war released and sent to their respective countries or nations or states of origin. All those soldiers that were captured, 500,000 of them were released to their respective countries and or returned home, normally we put it. The other advantage or the other success of League of Nations was in 1921. Mind you, the World War I, when it ended, and League of Nations tried to resolve the differences as part of the residual issues, it came up with the formation or the establishment of countries like Poland was established at that time. Then Finland another. The Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia were all formed out of League of Nations resolution of the World War One. You know, so this is also another advantage. The third one is Finland, 1921. Finland and Sweden had a problem with an island we call Ireland. Ireland, A-A-L-A-N, Ireland, A-A-L-A-N, Ireland. The ownership became a problem, so League of Nations had to resolve it, and so that arbitration came out successfully, and Sweden didn't take on Finland because Finland was a newly created nation at the time. Okay, so then other one was Greece. Greece went to war with Bulgaria in 1925, and League of Nations had to ask Greece to withdraw from Bulgaria and cease the war. Greece initially flexed its arms, but they said no. League of Nations held its ground and said, look, we'll put sanctions on you, Greece. And Greece quickly withdrew and ceased the war. And that is how good League of Nations was in using arbitration. So that was one of the notable points of use of sanctions to resolve a difference. It really worked at the time. And from then, League of Nations and then United Nations, that came up after Second World War, picked on use of sanctions to resolve issues. We have other treaties like the Locarno Treaty of 1925 that established the borders of Germany. It wasn't directly under League of Nations, but League of Nations contributed so much to establish the borders of Germany in 1925. Okay, then importantly for African countries was 1926, where League of Nations, for African countries, where League of Nations came up with this vestige of slavery, where slavery was totally banned globally. Slavery was totally banned globally under the League of Nations. So from there, most Africans, slavery killed a lot of Africans, far multiple times than the Holocaust did later on. The Holocaust did later on, far outnumbering that, but emphasis goes to the Holocaust, and the harm of slavery is always forgotten. That's rather sad for humanity. All right, so that's also another. Then another advantage League of Nations had, or the success it had, was it ventured into health, trying to eradicate malaria, leprosy, and others. So those were some of the successes of League of Nations. But how come the League of Nations became weak? By 1946, League of Nations was abolished or dissolved, and United Nations came in. So it means that it had weaknesses. Okay, one of the weaknesses was that the aggressor countries, you see, what we call the allied powers, were operating on it means that there was their own agreements. They undermine the authority. These are the aggressor countries. I'll tell you why they are aggressor countries. Britain, France, Italy, Japan, then USA, they formed the allied powers. The European ones and Japan are aggressor countries, very aggressive countries, but they rather condemn the other end, that's the Germany and co, as aggressors. But that is not the case. For an instance, they undermine the authority and the operations of League of Nations, and that's what weakened League of Nations. Let's look at it. Japan attacked one end of China, one region of China called Manchuria in 1932-33 thereabout. Japan attacked one end of China in 1932-33 thereabout. Japan is an aggressor country. It was an aggressor country in those times, though they formed the allied powers, and then they call the other ones central powers, and they attribute ill to them or evil to them. That's not true. The aggressor countries are rather France, Britain, Japan, Italy. You keep looking. Look at Japan. I've told you they attacked China, and at that time the League of Nations opposed Japan's attack on China, that region of China. Then in 1933, Japan said no, League of Nations could not admit China as a sovereign state into the League of Nations. And League of Nations says Japan no. So Japan got angry and then exited League of Nations. That is an aggressor country. Hitler under Germany was being convinced to change the way he looked at some of the other nations by League of Nations. Whilst in that process, France and Germany kicked against that process. They formed the Council of Ambassadors, a rival organization, to undo League of Nations, and that caused League of Nations badly. So then Hitler also got angry and exited out of the League of Nations because the Allied powers, France, Britain, Italy, Japan, were against Germany again. That's what caused the First World War anyway. They went to war. So Italy, Britain, and France undermined the authority again of League of Nations. Whilst League of Nations took up that there should be no slavery, all countries must be free countries and all that stuff, France and Britain had secretly, behind League of Nations, entered an agreement with Italy to hand over Abyssinia, that is Ethiopia, to them. Let me just put it this way. France and Britain had secretly agreed with Italy to hand over Abyssinia in Ethiopia to them. Ethiopia, that's in Africa. They wanted to hand it over to Italy. And that was also another no in 1935, thereabouts. Okay. This all culminated to the fact that you can tell that the aggressor countries are the Allied powers, but they rather write the literature to make the other side look so bad as though they are evil people. That's not true. They are rather the aggressor nations. So take note, look out for the way France, Britain, Japan, Italy behaves. Russia was initially not part because sometime in 1917, they are taking over the socialist view. So they changed to USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And because of that, their philosophy, the socialist philosophy, they were not allowed into League of Nations. They came in 1936 and they were expelled, 1935 thereabout, and they were expelled because they attacked Finland. Russia has ever attacked Finland before. Take note of these historical accounts and then look at what's going to happen in the future. Okay, those were the weaknesses, known weaknesses, means that the Allied powers themselves that formed or that initiated the formation of the Paris Peace Conference were the same countries that undermined the League of Nations. They formed the Paris Peace Conference, initiated with the help of the USA, initiated and introduced and enacted the League of Nations. These same powers undermined the League of Nations. And they are aggressive because they needed resources from other countries. And so they became so aggressive and undermining the same old rules. So sometime by 1946, April 1946, League of Nations was dissolved. Prior to then, there was a breakup of war in 1940-41 to 45, and that was the Second World War. If League of Nations was set up to prevent war and to ensure there was peace and security and there was cooperation between nations, then with the breakout of Second World War, it had failed. But does that failure means that the whole League of Nations process was not necessary? I'm not too sure. Does that mean that we should have set up United Nations? It's another discussion. Look on the front of your screen, you see the address of Understanding of United Nations that I've put there as a PowerPoint presentation under Atlas Stream and then academia.edu. You could click on them and then you would read. That would be a better way for me because I've done that. I did that earlier, so you could read and understand. It's in English. Those who are into French and other languages, you can have it translated by Google Translate. So that is how League of Nations died. By the ways, League of Nations, there was no country with a veto. There was no country with a veto. Within that short span between 1920 and 1946, League of Nations has done so much, yet Roosevelt the President of America decided that League of Nations should be shut and then United Nations should be formed. At the time, League of Nations, the head office or the headquarters was in Geneva. Now it should be brought to the United States of America, New York. And then veto given to the council. The veto that wasn't before, where every country had only one vote in decision making, now that veto had come in and you could be as many as 100 nations voting in one direction under the assembly or the General Assembly, but the veto at the Security Council, one country, either US, France, Britain, or Russia, or China, can knock it off and nothing will happen. All the 100 votes in one direction could be written off. How fair that is, I don't know. It's up to you. But I'm very certain that the veto was or is one of the ills of United Nations. It never existed in the League of Nations. The name is Hage Kwame Afaglu. If you have any questions, email or WhatsApp or call the numbers you have on the screen. Thank you.